Hi everyone. Uh, I hope you can hear me and I hope this is all working well. It's my first time doing one of these live stream sessions, so I hope we don't have any technical glitches. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking when you're doing a live demonstration of software, especially when it's pre-release software. So yeah, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Um, if someone could just let me know in the live chat if you can hear me and if you can see my screen and it all is looking good. Can someone give me a thumbs up or anyway, I'll keep going and just trust that this is working. Great, thanks for the confirmation. Okay, so my name is Niall Dawson. I'm from a company called North Road, but I'm also a QGIS developer. So I've been involved in the QGIS project for I think maybe over 10 years now. Um, and it's been a fantastic time. It's been a fantastic journey, and I'm really pleased to have been part of this community. Today, I wanted to give a bit of a rundown on one of the exciting features that's coming up in QGIS 3.14, which is a whole new framework that's landed in QGIS for time handling and for temporal filtering and animation creation. So if you're not aware of the QGIS release schedule, with the current stable release is 3.12, which has been out for a number of months now. 3.14 is coming out in just over a month. So it basically went down into its own kind of lockdown state last night. And it's now in a stabilization state where it'll be focused on bug fixing and just getting that 3.14 release in top shape for when it hits end users like a lot of you tuning in today. Um, the nice thing is anybody can get the pre-release now, so you can go onto the QGIS.org website and follow the links to one of the nightly or the weekly releases, and you can start testing this out. And definitely, if you do that and you have feedback, or you run into bugs, or run into issues, or just have suggestions in how it could be improved, definitely pass that feedback onto the project. It's very, very valuable. All right, let's kick off. Let me just find my. Let's get rid of this. Let's fire up my QGIS window. So here we have. Hi everyone, you can see me now. Um, Here we have a brand new copy of QGIS 3.14. We can test this if we look up here in the About screen. We've got the QGIS version is 3.13, the master version. So it's a beta version. What you see today might look a little bit different in the final release. Might be a little less buggy in the final release. Fingers crossed we don't see any bugs today again. All right, I got a whole bunch of stuff I'm going to run through today. So I'll start with what was I going to start with? I was going to start with this little project here. All right, so here I've just fired up a really simple QGIS project. So this one has got a bunch of raster layers in here. And these particular rasters represent different, let me just change something here for a second, different periods of time. So it's a series of aerial imagery that's been captured over a number of years of the same area. There's nothing special about these layers. These are just JPEG files. So it's just a standard georeference JPEG file that I've loaded into QGIS. Nothing fancy at all. This is basically like the simplest you can get. When I go into my layer properties here in QGIS 3.14, for a standard raster layer like this, I can go now, there's a new temporal tab here that we see, so temporal. And this has a few options. So first off, in my project here, I've ticked on this little temporal state to say, I actually want this layer here to be managed by the whole time framework in QGIS 3.14. By default, if I just put this layer in by the by drag and drop or adding the layer. This would be unchecked, but I'll just tick it. For my really basic JPEG layer here, I only have a single option. So the option that I get to set for this layer is a fixed time range. So this option, as the little helper text here says, this layer will only be shown if the animation time is within this current range. So I've set this manually. I took this from the metadata for the layer, but I've set a time range here to say that this layer applies between 2017, so December 2017 to May 2018. And like I said, I've got about half a dozen layers in my project here. If I look at the next one up, so this is similar. I've loaded this in, I've set it to temporal, and I've just put the fixed time range for this is slightly different because it's a different time range. So this one starts at the time that my previous one ended at, and then goes to mid-July, all the way up to this layer here, which is from 2019 to basically end of the month. So if I switch all these on, we can see something's a little bit different in that the layers have this little temporal icon next to it. And if I hover over that, it's indicating that it's a temporal layer. So that's just a little bit of a guide to say, hey, this layer here is being managed by the QGIS time framework. So its behavior will be a little bit different to a standard layer. And if I went in here and I turn this off, said it's not temporal, that indicator disappears. So now it's just a plain old raster layer, same as any old raster layer. But this is basically like a little guide to say, hey, things with this layer will be different to what you expect. All right, now if we actually want to see how the time framework works, there's a new toolbar button up here that looks like a clock. So if I hit this one, we get a new panel at the top of my screen here, the temporal controller. It defaults to being off, so I'm just going to switch this across to the animation mode. And we get a few controls here that we need to tweak initially. So first off, the most important one we've got here is the overall time range. So this date time represents basically the earliest time that I want to view in my project, and this one here is the latest time. And these are quite nice. If I just fiddle with this and just change this a bit, there's a button here that auto calculates this. So as it says, matches the time range to the project. When I hit that, it'll scan through all my temporal layers and try and work out the extents, that temporal extent based on the data that's present and the settings that are present for each of these time managed layers. So in this case, it's nice and simple because it's looking at our fixed time ranges, and it's saying basically taking the earliest, so 2017 1208 becomes the earliest time in our animation here, and then the latest is getting taken from the layer with the biggest time value. So that's now populated. So basically, this little slider here at the top is going to go from December 2017, all the way up to May 2020. So that's the first thing that I need to set up in my new time aware project. The second thing I need to set up is this step over here. So each map or each sort of frame in this animation, or when I use a time managed project, it represents a time range, and the length of that time range is set by this control here. So currently it's defaulted here to a 1 day time length, and we can see at the top there's a little label here that gives me the current time range, like the little slice of time that I'm viewing right now in my canvas. So you can see right now, this view is the time frame from 2017, 1208, so 8th of December 2017 to the 9th of December 2017. So it's a 1 day length. So our time interval here is dictating the overall length of time that we can actually view in our map. If I bump this up and say changed it to 10 days, then let me just step through to refresh that. So now my visible time range here is going from 2017, the 8th of December to the 18th of December, so a time range of 10 days. And you get lots of choice of units here as well, because some projects will be on a centuries level of time. Some might be on milliseconds, so you can tweak the time unit depending on what makes sense for your particular project. I'm going to set this back to 1 day for this data set. As I drag this little slider around at the top here, you'll see that the current time slice that we're viewing in the map is changing. So it's still keeping that 1 day length that I've got here, but we're getting a different 1 day depending on where the current slider sits. And you can see here, as I drag this backwards and forwards, the map's changing. So when I go from around about here, we've got a change. So around about 2018, May 11, 2018, we're seeing one of these layers switch off because of that static time range that's set in here. It's actually this one. So this one here is no longer becomes visible because it's past its end date, and the next one kicks in, which is this one, where I'm saying it starts at this time, at this date. So as I kind of step through and get past that that period, there we go. You could see one of the rasters is switching off and the next one's switching on. So the it's kind of like if I had set up a scale visibility for this layer. It's a good way of thinking about it with this mode. But instead of switching on and off the raster in a certain scale range, we're switching it on and off in a certain time range. So now as I drag my way through this slider, I can see the different aerial images kicking in and out depending on the current slice of time that I'm looking at. So the next thing we'll look at is we've got these controls up here, this little navigation object, which gives us the sort of standard playback controls. So at the moment it's in this pause mode, which means that I can just drag this around. It's not moving by itself. But if I put this back here and let me just check a setting here. I'll just reset that to default. If I hit the play button, my animation will start playing by itself. So now you can see the frame is advancing by my 1 day interval. So it's going tick, 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 tick through that overall time range that we've set up here. And it's stepping forward by our 1 day jump. So, by default, it's advancing 1 frame every second. So it's like a 1 frame per second animation. I can go to this little settings cogwheel icon up in the top right here and change that. So if I boost this up to say 30 frames a second to get a bit of a smoother animation, now you can see it's advancing a lot quicker because every 30 times a second we're jumping forward 1 day. And as it goes, we'll see those layers, that layer updates as different ones switch in and out again. So when I hit play, it'll basically play until it hits the end of that time frame and then stop. I could hit the reverse button, which will play that animation, that time backwards, so I could see the going back in time. There's also buttons here. If I'm in say the pause state, I can step forward frame by frame with this advance frame button, or reverse frame, which just steps backwards by 1 frame. We've also got rewind to start and jump to end. And right on the far side here, there's also a handy setting for looping the animation. So if I've got that on, as soon as the animation hits the end, it'll just jump back to the start and keep repeating. And basically just repeat indefinitely until I stop it. So let's let that go to the end and see that in action. Nearly there. So when it hits the end, it just jumps back to the start of the time frame and just keeps repeating. So I can see, just view that animation multiple times. Okay, let's stop that. So this is the simplest way of setting up an animation. It's basically like the a blunt force approach where you've just got non-time aware data sets. I've put them in there and I've manually made them time aware by giving them this fixed time range setting. Um, it works well for certain data sets. Like I said, for kind of non-time aware data sets, it's a great fallback. But if I had, say, I don't know, 100 different layers here, it would be pretty tedious to go in here and set up the time slice for each of those. So yeah. So let's have a look at some other ways we can get time aware data into a project. Um, so this whole temporal framework in QGIS was started by um, an organization called Cartosa, and we have developer Sam Welly from Cartosa in the chat at the moment. So Sam Welly is actually the one who kicked all this off. So big thanks to you. And one of the motivators for this temporal framework was initially to get handling of WMS services, WMST services. So you've got, I've probably got this backwards now, but you have WMTS, which is like the tiled service, and then you have WMST, which is like a time aware WMS server. So I'm going to load one in here from Meteorological Service of Canada Web Services. So this is just a WMS server, but it's also a WMS with time aware metadata in there. You can load this service into an older version of QGIS and it will just appear like a sort of static WMS layer. But when you pull it into QGIS 3.14, you can see it's actually automatically set up some temporal capabilities for this layer. So what it's done is it's checked the WMS and it's queried its metadata and said, you've got this time capabilities. So I'm going to make things easy for users. I'll set up as much as possible of this in advance. So let's have a look and see what's actually done here. If I go to my little time indicator and I click on that. So in this case, the layer's been made temporal again with that tick box under the temporal tab. But unlike my plain JPEG layers, it's not set to a fixed time range. It's actually now set to this automatic mode, which wasn't available for my basic JPEG files. So it's pulled this in and set it to the automatic. And what automatic actually means is that it's going to delegate responsibility for that time handling to the backend. So in this case, the WMS server itself, and basically say, hey, you've got all that knowledge about this data that's been set up by the data custodians. So we're going to let you be responsible for how this layer handles the time dimension. And make things easy for users because we don't have to go in there and do any kind of configuration. So let's have a look at this one. Let's go back to the animation mode for this. And I'm just going to change a few settings here for values that make sense for this data set. So this is a air temperature over time layer, which is coming from the WMS. And let's just zoom in somewhere a bit interesting. Unfortunately, this WMS is a little bit slow to access for myself, so you could see there's quite a delay between each request and when that comes back, which is a little bit annoying. But all right, so this when I loaded this WMS time aware layer into my new project, it's automatically set up the overall time range here. So it's saying that this particular data set has data available between 15th of May to 25th of May. And that's basically the time range that's been set up by that custodian of where that data is available. And as I step through this, just going through frame by frame, it's requesting a new slice of that layer from the backend. Takes a little bit of time again because I it's not quick to access this particular service for me. But after it's done it once, that image is cached, so at least it's fast to jump back and start navigating through that, and I can see the change in time. In this case, in 3-hour increments, like so. Um, Now, because this is like a unified time handling capabilities, if I had this layer in my project, I could add other ones that are like I showed just before, that sort of static time frame setup, and they'll all be managed by this single slider. So it doesn't matter what the sort of source of the data is, this applies to all the layers in your project. Right, so that's a WMS with time-aware capabilities. And again, you'll notice this mostly because when you load a layer in from a WMS, you'll see it gets that little time indicator straight away. Okay, the next one I'm going to look at is I'm going to load in a mesh data set. So meshes, if you're not familiar with them, they started landing in QGIS maybe around the 3.4 era, I think, and they've basically been made more and more powerful over time. A lot of this is driven by the Crayfish plugin and users who use these mesh data sets for things like water modeling and flood management and this kind of thing. But they're also used a lot with weather data. So in this case, I'm going to pull in a data set that's got so this is Hurricane Michael data. Let's add this one. And a lot of these mesh data types are sort of inherently time aware. So again, when I pull this one into my project, it's automatically defaulted to being a time aware layer. So it knows that this particular one, it's got temporal metadata, so it's kind of set that up for us. If we have a look in here, mesh layers are a little bit different. So here the settings are different to what we saw for the rasters. So for meshes, we have things like the choice of time units. We have the reference time, which is basically like the start of that data set, and a few other things there. But let's just bring up the styling panel for this one because this is where it gets interesting. So at the moment, for this mesh layer, I'm looking at one of the data sets or one of the groups inside this data, which is the wind data. And let's have a look as we slide this time slider through. We can see there's a ton of data in here in really nice increments. So as I step through, it'll look even better if I play it. You could see this weather data change over time. Let's make it a little bit smoother by pulling down the increment. So while this is playing, I can still get in there and interact with my map in all the usual ways, zooming in and out and switching on and off layers and whatnot. But it's the time slider up here is exactly the same as we've seen before. So it's still using the same approach of having a interval for this frame, in this case 1 hour, so from 1500 to 1600, and the overall time range here that dictates the earliest and latest times. So I could slide this time slider through here. I could actually change if I want to visualize a different data set here. So let's say I want to look at the temperature data. Meshes are kind of cool because they can sometimes have these sort of contour based stuff in here as well. So I could set up something like this. So now I can see the temperature data in the background along with the wind with little arrows, and you can see again that's animating and changing over time as my time slice advances through this layer. So really great for visualizing modeling results, especially if you've got stuff like I said from water modeling. programs like TwoFlow, you can pull it in here and you can animate that over time and see exactly how that changes. Okay, so that's rasters, and we've looked at our WMS, we've looked at mesh. Now I'm going to explore my personal favorite, which is the vector time handling. I really like this because there's heaps of ways that you can tie time-aware vectors in with QGIS's symbology engine to make some awesome effects. So that's what we're going to cover now. I just need a drink from my QGIS mug. Okay, I'm going to pull in for my vector data. So I've just loaded in a geo package here that has some historic earthquake data. So if I have a look at the table for this one, we can see that we've got the critical field here is our time field. So this particular data set is seismic events over time, and it has some attributes like the actual time that measurement was taken. And if we scroll right here, the other interesting one that we'll look at today is there's a magnitude attribute here, which is varying from null for whatever reason. So varying from about 2.6 to about 6.3. So that's sort of the magnitude of that seismic event. Fortunately, in this data set, I can see that my time column is a date time type by hovering over the header bar here. So that's great. It's already a native date time type, so I don't have to do any messing around with converting string-based dates or times into native date times. So I can just jump straight to visualizing this by going into my layer properties, whoops, in the temporal tab. So when I tick this one, I have a whole bunch of different configuration options here for how this vector layer will be time aware. So like my basic JPEG demo from the start, the one option we've got is just a fixed time range. So the little helper text here describes exactly what that means. So it's when I'm set to fixed time range, all the features from that layer will be rendered whenever the map's temporal range overlaps the range defined below. So this one lets me just set up that kind of overall static time range to say, just turn on this layer, render all the dots inside it when my time is between the 6th of May and 29th of May. So again, it's basically the equivalent of that raster mode where it's just this time range applies to the whole of that data set. Not particularly interesting, but it could be useful if you had, say, if that time data was split over multiple layers. We've also got options here for a whole lot of different configurations that will apply depending on how the fields are actually structured inside that vector layer. So we have one for a single field with date time, separate fields for start and end date time, separate fields for a start and event duration, start and end time from expressions, and one that we'll cover later. So in this case, our data set had a single field. It had just that one time field. In this case, the field's actually named time, but we had just that one field that was basically like the measurement time. It's kind of like a zero length instantaneous event. So we pick the single field with date time mode, pick our field, and the little helper text here says individual features from the layer will be rendered if that field's value falls within the map's temporal range. So if the time value from any of these little dots sits within that current slider definition interval, then we'll see that particular dot. So let's do that. Go back into our animation mode. I'll hit this button here to recalculate that overall time range. So it's picked up that the earliest date in that field was 2010, the latest was 2017. In this case, a 1 hour step is not very useful, so I'm going to make this a 3-week step. And as I just scrub through this timeline here, you can see that different events are turning on and off depending on what the value for that time field is, if it sits within this current 3-week range. So let's go back to the start here, and I'm just going to quickly throw some data in the background here so that we're not looking at a white screen. So I'm just going to grab, let's put this in, some natural earth country layer, and let's just make it a bit less ugly. So I don't know, we'll do something like this. All right, so now at least we've got some reference in the background there. And I'll also make these a bit less ugly because I don't like that default dot. Okay, if I play this animation now, let's see what happens. Yeah, it's pretty useless. Okay, so let's start off by pulling this frame rate down a bit. So we don't want it to go through our animation quite as fast. So I'm going to pull that down to say 10 frames a second. So it's stepping through a little bit slower now. I could also change maybe my time slice interval to 1 week, and that's also obviously going to slow down the overall progression from the start of our animation to the end because we're stepping through at smaller jumps. And we can see the events switching on and off there over time. If I stop that, I can again scrub this to get particular slices of time. Honestly, I see like quite a lot of animations that look like this where someone will load in the temporal data and just export that, and you get a lot of dots kind of moving really quick on a map that doesn't really show you anything. It's moving so quickly for a start that it's really hard to actually pick out patterns in this data, and it's hard for the brain to kind of comprehend that. It just looks like movement everywhere, just overload. But there's a lot of tricks we can use that'll help fix that and will improve the look of this animation. But before I get to those, I'd just like to cover what this button up here does. So these little controls on the top left of our temporal controller dock, they dictate the overall time handling for this view. So when you first load it up and you hit the time button, it will be on this mode, which is temporal navigation disabled. And you can see when I do that, I get all my events. So now it's no longer applying this filter here. It's still set up so that I can quickly jump back to it. But when I've got this on, it's saying that this map view here, it's everything. It's just that whole layer as if it wasn't time aware. The one we've been looking at up till now is the last one here, which is the animated mode, which gives us these controls, and you're stepping through it in a certain fixed time interval. So we're jumping through 1 week by 1 week per frame. But the middle one here is the fixed range temporal navigation. So this one is really handy when you have a particular time range, like an exact start and end time that you want to visualize on that map. So when I'm doing this mode here, like I said, it's jumping through 1 week by 1 week. And if I had a particular time that I want to see, like if I wanted just to see the events that happen between the start of May and the end of May, it's almost impossible to do. I could drag this around until I get to close to that. But now, that's not a month long. If I change this to say 30 days, I'm going to have to try and find a start. It's really hard to get a precise slice of time visualized in this in this mode. And that's what the fixed time range mode is for. So if I go here, this just gives me two controls, which give me the earliest time and the latest time I want to view in that map. So I could say here, nice and quickly, give me all the events that happened in May 2015 to the end of May. Oops, I probably should do 23, something like that. So the end of May 2015. So now we've got an exact time range that we've defined there, and that's the only events we'll see are the ones that sit exactly within that time range. So this is good if you have a particular range that you want to see. One nice thing is that if I bring up a print layout here and throw a map onto this print layout, I actually get this control now for my print layout map as well. So I could put a little map in my layout. By default, again, that's not filtering by time, but I could turn on the temporal range mode and say, hey, this one here should be showing me everything in let's do the whole of 2015. Okay, so now this map in my print layout is showing me all the events that happened from the start of 2015 to the end of 2015. And I can actually put a fixed range for my layout there. So this is cool because now I could say put another one here, change this time range to 2016. So we've got one view for the 2015 events, one view for the 2016 events, and I could set up like a small multiples type layout where I see a bunch of different time ranges here, and get like a kind of a static layout which shows me a change over time. That is 2018. Did I do that right? No, only one event. Like so. And so I could make a really cool layout here, put some labels in here saying 2017, make that a bit bigger. Totally misleading because I think that was 2015, wasn't it? So 2015, 2016, 17, and 2018. And we've got a nice, well, nearly nice small multiples layout. So I could export that as a single page PDF. Or if I wanted to kick it up a notch, let's get rid of that. I actually could have the option here next to these start and end times. You can click on this and you can actually make that data defined. So I could take that from like a field in an atlas layer. So make a print atlas, which instead of being instead of moving around in a different spatial extents over time, it actually moves through different time ranges. So it could show me a page for January, February, March, April, and just throw it all out as an atlas. So that's a cool feature as well. Right, let's go back to here. So that's our filter modes. So we've got the off, turn off the time filtering, show me everything, a fixed range where I can put it in precisely, and then the animation control that we've looked at before. I've got a little visitor here. Hey, CC. This is my daughter, CC. It's 5 a.m. here, so kids just waking up. All right. Okay, yeah, that was what I was going to show you. When I'm in my animation mode and I've got my animated map here, showing me those events changing over time. There's a button here next to all these controls for export. So if I hit that one, uh, this one actually gives me the option to save out those animation frames to PNG files or JPEG files or whatever you want. And it'll fill in the frame number into this little hash kind of template. So I could say frame hash, put it in an output folder, and hit save, and it will dump out each of those frames one by one. So you have like frame 000, 001, etc., which you could then use with an external program or a tool like FFmpeg or one of those command line tools to turn into a video type animation. And actually, I've got one here because Richard sent me one overnight. So let me show you the one that he did using this. He beat the workshop by a day. So he's used this to set up a vector animation, save it out frame by frame, and then using I think it was FFmpeg tool to actually turn this into an MP4 animation. So you've got the capability to create a video file from these maps that you could then upload to YouTube or whatever. It's kind of nice here because you get defined control over the exact output width and height. So I could say this should be whatever it is, 1800 by 1200. Lock that ratio, and then I'll draw the actual extent that I want to output there. And you've got that overall time choice again there. So you can set it up exactly how you want it in terms of the output size and the extent and such. Right. Let's get to some really fun stuff now. Where am I at? Where am I at? Okay. So, like I mentioned before, when I'm going through this particular animation, the events are turning on and off really quickly. They're basically showing for one frame and then switching off. So they're showing for one frame because in this case we're using the mode where our events are defined as like a single time instant. So it's like a 0 second long interval that basically occurs at this time, and that's it. If I was using one of the other time modes, like a separate field for start and end time, then our events might actually happen over a few different frames. So if they say you might have a year-long event that happens, so it'll show for a longer period on this map, and that would help get rid of that flickery kind of turning on and off effect. But what we're going to do with this particular data set is I'm going to try and avoid this flashy turn on and off effect by fudging the data a little bit. So I'm going to say in my temporal settings, I'll leave it at this single field of date and time. So my event's happening at the value from the time field, but I'm actually going to make it have a duration. So instead of being like a 0 length time interval, let's put, we're going to make these go for, let's say, turn on for 3 weeks. So my events go for 3 weeks. Let's change this setting a little bit. Okay, so now when I'm paging through, my events aren't turning on and off during that sort of single frame where they intersect that time, because now my events actually go for 3 weeks. So they're going to show for, well, 21 frames. So as I play, let me speed this up because that's going too slow. We'll go 30 frames a second. So now we've helped reduce that effect of things turning on and off too quickly. So instead of them just being turning on, turn off, turn on, turn off, they're staying for a little bit longer, which gives your brain a little bit more time to sort of process that event and see, oh, there's a cluster that happened here. There's something that happened up here, and then they'll disappear over time. But instead of just being like a flash, you actually can get a bit more of a feel for the pattern of that data. So that's cool, but let's make it a bit cooler, because what we can do here is we can start to take advantage of QGIS Symbology's data defined options to control the appearance of these dots over time. If you're not familiar with data defined controls, they're these little widgets that sit to the right of a lot of settings in QGIS. And in this case, I'm going to data define the size of these events. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to use the assistant mode. So what this does, usually you use the assistant mode to say scale these dots by a fixed quantity. So I could scale them by the magnitude, for instance. And now we get a map that's actually showing me the magnitude of these events as the size of those dots. They're turning off and on over time. So that's what this assistant is usually used for. But in my animation, I'm going to change the way we use this. Instead of using the size as a fixed quantity, so from an attribute in there, I'm going to actually set up a little expression here that looks a bit like this. So first off, I'm going to look under my variables panel, my variables group. Sorry, I'm going to look under my fields group, and I'm going to get the time for my event. So that's the actual time that observation was taken. And from that, I'm going to subtract a variable, and the variable I'm going to take away is this one that's called, where are we? Oh, map start time. So the helper over here says this variable stores the start of the map's temporal time range. So if I do that, my expression is now the time value taking away the start time. So it's basically the difference in time between when that frame started and when the event actually occurred. And you can see in the little preview here, it's giving me a value as an interval. So I'm just going to wrap that in, let's wrap it in the function day, which gets the day length out of that interval. So now we've got a numeric value that comes out of that. And I'll just hit OK. We need to define here as well the expected value range. So in this case, we expect this to go from 0 to 21 days. Actually, I've got this around the wrong way, so let me just fix this. All right, so I'm missing something here. What am I missing? Oh, I have this 21 weeks. Oops, it should be 21 days. Okay, that's better. So now what we're getting is, let's stop the animation and find a point in time. So when my event first occurs, say there, this little expression that I set up in my assistant, the number of days between the start of that map time frame, so this one, and the actual event time, that should be 0, and it should keep counting up. So it'll go 0 days as I step through to the next frame. That'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 21, at which case my event, I've said, takes 21 days, so it'll fall off the map, it'll disappear. So this value is increasing from 0 to 21 as we step through our animation now, and that's changing the size of that dot. So it's getting bigger over time. So, this is actually the opposite of what we want, because we want our events to basically like pulse. So we want them to start big and just like fade out over time. So I'm going to use this option here to apply a transform curve, and let's tweak this a little bit. So I want my events to start big and then over time sort of gradually fade off. So let's just mess around with this a little bit. This transform curve is dictating how these values that come in, so from a value from 0 over here will basically map across to a size of 10, and as we go, a value of 21 will map across to a size of, I want 0. So it'll start off big, like you can see, and quickly fades out or quickly drops in size and slowly gets to 0. So it comes in and fades out over time. So it means that we see the events that actually happened at that slice in time are nice and big because they're the ones that just happened, like this. And then as they get older, they disappear off our map. So now if I play it, you can see we start to get a better feel for these clusters. And it's definitely taken away that really flashy feel that our initial map had. We could make this even better actually, because instead of just starting at a size of 10, let's make them pop in and then fade out. So I'm going to tweak this little slide, this curve thing a little bit, because I want this to look something like this. So they're going to come in really quick, my dots, bounce in quickly. So they're starting at a size of 0, they bounce in and then they fade off. So really fast attack, slow decay. Let's jump back here, because if we make them a little bit transparent, we'll get a better feel for this as well. Maybe I need to turn this one off. And I'm just going to speed this up a little bit to make it faster to view. That's a bit too much. Let's drop that back down. So now we've got an animation where those events are kind of pulsing in, bouncing in, and then they fade out. They bounce in, they fade out. And it's really cool because I can go into this assistant and I can tweak this all interactively while my animation's playing. So I could see, well, what would happen if I set up something crazy like this? And now my events are kind of bouncing in. They're taking a while to come in, and then they're taking just as long to fade back out again. And I could just mess around with this until I'm really happy with how this looks and the actual appearance of how these go. I kind of like something like this, maybe a bit faster, like that. So they're bouncing in, fading out, bouncing in, fading out. Right. So that's our. So now we've got now we're seeing those events. The one disadvantage of this though is all our dots are basically showing at the same size. They're regardless of the magnitude of that event. I actually might want to tweak this a little bit, and maybe I'm going to take my magnitude field and multiply that in there. And I know that my magnitude went up to about 6, so our expected values have to be about 126. So now what we will have is the overall size of the dot that's bouncing in and out will be scaled by that magnitude value as well. So the bigger events will show as bigger dots, but they'll all still fade in, size in and out, pulse in and out over time. So now it's looking pretty sweet. I still think that's a little bit too slow, so I'm just going to tweak this a bit. Yeah, anyway. I could spend ages tweaking that. But definitely much improved over our first version. Now, a cool thing is we can actually use these data-defined options to change other parts of this map as well. So one common request, and actually I should say before I go any further, if you've used QGIS up to version 3.14, there's a really cool plugin called Time Manager, which has offered a lot of this functionality going right back to the sort of QGIS 2 days. And a lot of this new inbuilt functionality was based off the Time Manager plugin. So Time Manager still has functionality that the native time handling doesn't have, but the plan is basically to mesh the two so that there'll be just one framework that does everything. And one of the things that Time Manager does that the inbuilt one doesn't do yet is an option to show the current time on your map. So when you're exporting those frames, you could see that time change in that export. I'm going to do this in a slightly different way. And the way I'm going to do this is, first off, I'm going to add a new layer to my map with just a single point in here. So I'm going to just fudge it by doing a temporary layer, a point temporary layer, and I'll put one dot on my map inside this temporary layer. There we go. This little dot here, I'm going to go into there, turn on the labels for that, and I want to show for the label for that little dot. I'm going to take it from a variable, and the variable will be the start time of that animation frame. So the map start time. This is again, it's a date time value. So I'm just going to wrap this up in format date. Format it as year, month, day, day. So there we go. So now my preview is giving me a string value, and I can see this little dot here now has a label that is the start date of the map. We'll make it bigger just so we can see it. Right, and if I play my animation, it's not really looking how I expect because I want this to change over time. The reason that's not changing is because when I'm stepping through this animation frame by frame, QGIS is being smart about which layers it's actually redrawing here. So it's basically looking through and it's only updating the layers that have got this little temporal icon. So it says, well, my country boundaries, they're not changing. I don't need to redraw that. I'll save some processing time and speed up the animation by just leaving them. In this case, it's doing it for my point label time one as well, which is not what I want. I actually wanted to redraw this. So I'm going to go into my label properties for this one, my layer properties, turn on the temporal mode, and in this case, I'm going to go to this special option that is the redraw layer only configuration. So this one here, it says the layer will automatically be redrawn whenever the temporal range is changed. So whenever we go to the next frame, but no time-based filtering is applied. And a bit more text says, the configuration is useful when the layer has symbology settings which vary based on the temporal range, exactly this case. So let's turn that mode on. And as we play now, we're getting our labels are being redrawn at the same thing as well. So, and we can see we've now got a nice display here of the current time in my animation. I'd probably go here, change that to no symbols to get rid of the little dot. And I could go in and I could set up, make this look nicer by whatever, putting on text buffers and any kind of labeling stuff you feel like in here. I would not do that. Maybe a drop shadow or something to make it stand out a bit more. So we've got now a nice little time readout. I can actually take this a little bit further. Let's do something a bit more involved. I'm going to make another point layer, a little temporary one, throw a dot in here. This one, I'm going to set it also to our redraw only mode. I'm going to turn this little dot into a time, like a progress bar that fills up over the animation time. So to do that, I'm going to go into my dots symbology and change it from a simple marker to an ellipse marker, which is oddly named because in this case, I actually don't want an ellipse. I want a rectangle shape like this. And in this case, I want to data define the symbol width. So I want this little rectangle to grow over time. So I'm going to go into my assistant here again, into the expression builder. And in this case, I need to set up an expression that will scale from 0 to 1 as my animation advances. So it's going to look like this. I'm going to get the variable, which is my map start time here. And I'm going to take away, yep, that's right. I'm going to take away the one that's called animation start time, which is the overall time range of the animation. So the very earliest, like the time from the first frame. Again, that gives me an interval value, so I'm just going to pull the seconds of those out to get a numeric value. And I'm going to divide that by the animation interval, which is the length of my entire time range. So that will give me a value from 0 to 1, and as the animation progresses, it'll go from 0 at the very start. The closer we get towards the animation, it'll get to a value of 1. So let's put that range in here. So our values are going from 0 to 1. And our output values should be going from, well, this looks fine. Let's say 1 to 100 maybe. And here's, we've got a little progress bar now. It's not really a progress bar yet, but we've got a little bar that's growing over time. Let's make it move a little bit faster. All right, so it's growing over time, but it's not quite what I want because I don't want it to be like that. So I'll change the anchor from horizontal to left. So now it's growing, but it's growing from the left side. And we'll just do some other little things here, like I'll make this a bit higher. I'm gonna duplicate that, turn off that, make this 200. Oops, gonna move my point. That's too much. So let's do 100 again. Oh, that's why, because I did 2000. 200, fix that back up again. And my background one can be like a kind of grey color. So now we've got a symbol, which is a progress bar that basically fills up as my animation progresses. And if I slide back here, we can see how that works. A really nice thing is there's nothing in this symbol that has got hard-coded values. So it's all being done by the expression that is using variables to take the map start time, the animation start time, and the animation interval. So if I messed around with these values, say refining my animation so it only shows 2012, I don't have to change anything in that symbol definition. It's basically adapted immediately. So I could save that one to my style library. So we give it a tag of animation, and this is the progress bar symbol. I could share that with someone else, or I could reuse that at a later stage without having to do any kind of tweaks at all. Right, I've used up my hour that I said I was going to allocate, but I'm going to give one little bonus thing that I was playing with just before we started this, which I think is kind of cool. So if you can give me an extra 5 minutes, I'll show you this too. I was setting up this animation just before going live with this demo, and I thought, let's try something a bit adding on something else on top of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and use the animation framework here to give me some animated water lines that come out of the edge of our maps. So let's see if I can do this. What I'm going to do first off is I'm just going to duplicate this land layer. So I'll duplicate that. I'm going to call this one water. And in this case, again, I'm going to say it's a temporal layer, but it's just a redraw only layer. Okay, now for my waterline test, I'm going to make this layer, it's just a simple line outline with a nice blue color. And what I want to do is I want to get this offset control that I can manually set, but I want this to be dynamic, so I want it to grow. So it's sort of like, yeah, sort of flow out from the coast. So what I could do here is I'm going to go back in and tweak this, put an expression in for my offset for the line. What I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to use a different variable that we haven't used before, which is the map. Where are we? what's called, oh, the frame number variable. So the frame number gives me the current frame number during animation playback. So I want to take my frame number. I'm going to do like a remainder calculation here. So this value for my offset will vary between 0 and 30 as the animation progresses, but it should loop. So let's just see. I think I might need to scale it. Let's scale it by 0.1. Oh, I know what's happening. We're going the wrong way. We'll reverse that. All right, so now we're getting some kind of crazy stuff going. Uh, but we have this offset is now going from every 30 frames, it's repeating, and it's growing out from our coast. This might be the wrong way. Probably actually should be going into the coast, but yeah, whatever. It's also way too fast, so let me just tweak this a little bit. Let's change this. That one can be, say, 90 and 0.03. All right, that's a bit smoother. The other thing I want to do is I want these to fade out because that needs to disappear over time. So let me get that bit of the expression. And I'm going to use something called set color part from the original color, change the opacity so that the opacity is going to vary from, let's see how that works. Yeah, so now they're basically fading out as they get further and further out. So I could set up all these kind of rules in my project to animate other parts as well. So I've got my actual temporal events, the earthquakes are showing, and they're doing that nice bounce effect that we set up earlier. We've got our progress bar here, and now we've got other little bits that are just adding some more motion in that map as well. So then I'd save it out to a PNG, turn it into a video, and I'm done. I've got my awesome QGIS 3.14 animated project. And that's the end of today's session. So thanks for tuning in. My name's Niall Dawson. Where did my slide go that I was going to show at the end? It disappeared. Let me bring that up. Yeah, here we go. If you're interested, subscribe to this YouTube channel. I guess I'd love to do more like this if you think they're valuable. Follow on Twitter. So we've got that's my personal Twitter, and also North Road Geo one. Post a lot of tips like this as well. And the North Road blog as well has lots of tips like this that will help you know what's coming in QGIS new versions and getting the most out of them. But if you like this video, please let me know, because if it's valuable, if you want to see more like this, if there's particular topics you want to see, comment on this or on Twitter and let me know. But thanks for tuning in. Cheers.